Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Tim Dalton, who's Director of Professional Services at BluJay Solutions, and Alan Pyrett, who is QA Manager, Managed Analytical Services at BluJay Solutions as well. And today we're going to talk about leveraging data to drive operational and procurement decisions in transportation. Now, there's also, thanks to all sorts of technology, and system integrations, we probably have more data today than ever before. And this is particularly true in transportation. But how can companies convert that data into insights and then leverage those insights to make smarter and more effective operational and procurement decisions? Well, that's the main theme of today's episode. And it's great to have Alan and Tim on the program to share their insights and advice on this topic. So Alan, Tim, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Well, Alan, first-time guest, so welcome. And let's just get started with just the basic question, right? I mean, we like to talk about data, and data is almost like this amorphous thing that we talk about. But when it comes to driving transportation-related decisions, I mean, what type of data are we talking about, and where or how is it collected?
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. Really excited to be here, as I said earlier. But to understand and define what kind of data you need, you've got to understand what kind of transportation decisions you're interested in making. For example, if you are temporarily going to shut down a plant and you need to work on pivoting your sources to an alternative facility, you've got to understand your own current capacity. Is it able to pivot and assist you during that time period where you're going to be shutting down that facility? If not, do you need to work on conducting a short-term bid? And having some understanding of market context is really important too. Understanding what's happening to spot market rates versus contract rates during that period of time. If you need to focus on a strategy that's really going to pull you away from spot market, or if you can focus on, covering with your asset contract rates. Other things like tender acceptance might be a good gauge to understand how you're going to be able to handle coverage and so on and so forth. But, at the end of the day, it's really going to start with understanding your own network in a general sense, whether that be seasonality, your equipment mode, and your equipment types and your modes, and what the mix of that looks like for your own network, your lane data, and where your stuff is coming from and where it's all going, going into your shipment level data. You've really got to understand and hone in on what your network looks like today. And going further into your question to talk about how data is being collected, well, if you have a good TMS partner, it's really easy because, for example, with BluJay, we capture data at all of the important milestone events. And you can use that data in a lot of different powerful ways. And it helps ensure that you have a broad understanding of everything that's occurring from your order to cash cycle. Furthermore, it's key to understand and to look into clear reporting and to make sure that you have a set cadence to be able to review reporting based off of all of the data that you're capturing. Now, if you don't have a TMS partner, then it might be a little bit more difficult to build out those tools in order to visually understand your network or even to house your data. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could start with collecting your BOLs and storing it in Excel and starting, some kind of visualization purposes that way. But, at the end of the day, it's probably more important that you get in partnership with a TMS provider.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think and certainly that was one of the key lessons learned of 2020 for sure, right? I mean, I think if you were relying, if you were still operating your business, any aspect of your business, like it was still 1999, you were in serious trouble because, the need to make smart and efficient decisions became more critical last year than ever before. And it was those companies that have invested in technology, and in the case of transportation, obviously transportation management systems, to get that visibility and that understanding that you were talking about. I think is, yeah, was pretty critical. And I think what you said also, in terms of putting it in context, when you talk about which data is important. And I noticed, that's another question. Is it data or is it data? But that's a whole nother, this discussion, right? But yeah, you say tomato, I say tomato. But I think putting it, I think you're right. That's pretty insightful. I mean, I think, understanding, number one, the broader context in terms of understanding your network. And then number two, understanding the different scenarios and the different questions you want to answer, then will dictate what type of data you need to be collecting to be able to answer those questions or make the decisions you want to make. So it's almost like, you don't want to collect data for the sake of just collecting data. You want to collect data because you've given some pre-thought in terms of what actions you may want to take or what decisions you need to make in order to, again, to successfully navigate not only what's happening today, but what may happen tomorrow, right?
Exactly. I think that, it's incredibly important to be able to understand your historical data and how that's really going to measure up against the market too. As the old adage goes, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. And being able to take your historical data and maybe even, pushing it, taking the next step forward into forecast using things like economic indicators and sales forecasts and your expectations to growth, and using all of that to compare against market data, especially lately, is extremely important, and it's becoming increasingly more and more important. Speaking on market data, for a second, looking at things like with what BluJay offers, we offer something called the Freight Market Index. We call it the FMI, right? It's a free monthly publication, and it contains a variety of core different KPIs, not just cost metrics. And it measures the performance of all of our shippers in the BluJay network. Using tools like that to understand where I stand up against the market is increasingly more and more important. So
yeah, that's a great point. So I mean, so let's say now you've done all the upfront work and you've got all the necessary data, all the data that you want to have. I mean, how should companies use it to understand and improve their day-to-day operations?
Yeah, great question. So data and metrics are key. If you can't measure it, then you can't manage it, right? So first, you really need to make sure that you're measuring all of the key aspects of your business that are clearly defined in your measurement strategy. What's important to my business, and I got to understand that, and I got to make sure that we're watching those metrics as they change over time, right? For example, just some of the other, some of the small ones like on-time performance, tender acceptance, cost metrics, and efficiency measures. Like, I want to make sure that I'm keeping my thumb on a pulse of where those are heading. And it's also key that we communicate that up and down the supply chain and make sure that all of the appropriate stakeholders involved are informed of what those metrics that we're following are. We don't want to manage in bubbles. We want to make sure that all of the appropriate stakeholders are involved. Anybody from the order to the cash work cycle or order to cash cycle is involved with these metrics, and everybody's aligned with focusing on improving the areas where we want to be improving.
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of providing some visibility and transparency to what's happening there and providing that across the organization. I mean, I know that, if you think back to obviously 2020, we've talked a lot about 2020 over the past, few months and what's happened there. But if you think back to 2018, the surprise that many CFOs had when their transportation budgets were blown out of the water. And, the last thing you want to do is for a CFO to get surprised, that market was heading in a particular direction, right? So being able to provide visibility across the board, and in particular to the C-level, to give them, so they're not caught off guard, but they're also able at the appropriate level to keep, a pulse on what's happening from that standpoint, I think is important. Tim, just to bring you into the conversation, your thoughts on that question. I mean, in terms of leveraging data, how can companies do that, or some examples to improve the day-to-day operations?
Yeah, no, I think that When I think about data, I think, so I've been in logistics operations, procurement now for about 18 years. So I think back to 18 years ago, what data was like and reporting and visibility till now. And, it's changed drastically and it continues to change. We went from really not having any data to then getting to the point where we all of a sudden had all the data in the world, but we didn't know what to do with it. Now I think we're getting better as far as really being able to drill down into the data to really start to understand root cause a little bit more. So I mean, just from an example standpoint, where once data really started becoming available, when I start to think about operations and shippers really tracking their operations and determining whether carriers are performing at a high level or not, they start coming out with a carrier scorecard. And a carrier scorecard, it would say your tender acceptance is X, and if you're above this line, if you're below this line, if you're above this line, you're great, if you're below this line, you're terrible. But what it didn't account for is that you can award a carrier a lane which has 500 annual loads, and maybe something changes within the network, and you ship 500 loads in the first 2 months. The volumes increase drastically, and even though the carrier may have been planning for 40-ish loads a month, maybe now they're not taking all of them that are being offered, but they're still doing 60. They're still doing 20 more per month than they planned on it. But if you look at their tender acceptance, it's just going to tell you that they're not performing at the level that you need them to perform. So I think, as data and the availability of data and what we now know, to look for in some of the tools that exist to really dissect and drill into the data, it puts us all in a better position to truly look to see how is a carrier performing versus what they committed to. And rather than unfairly penalizing carriers, it offers greater opportunity to potentially celebrate, a carrier's achievement or what they're actually doing to help you out above and beyond what they committed to. So, I think from an example standpoint, it's just, when I hear Alan speak to the data and all the data that's available now, and I think, my own career and how kind of it's evolved over the past 18 years, I think we're getting much better with understanding data, knowing what to look for, and, not necessarily just looking at it black and white.
Yeah, it's a great point, because I mean, I think it's understanding the story behind the numbers,
Yep,
and the
absolutely.
story behind the bars and graphs and everything else. And if you're just looking at that, if you're just purely looking at, the bar charts and the graphs, or the tolerance levels, and you're not really understanding the story behind it, you can make, poor decisions, or you can come to the wrong conclusion. So I think that's a great point. Alan, and you kind of touched upon this a little bit. But I guess the question is, it's probably relatively easy, particularly if you've got the data and the reports and everything else, to say, hey, measure yourself in terms of how you're doing relative to last year, or how you're doing relative to your budget or your plans. But I mean, how do you know if you're making progress relative to others, in the market? In other words, I mean, how do you benchmark yourself, especially in an environment right now that's so volatile?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we're talking about that, since I think that it's an obvious pink elephant in the room that the market's been quite unstable. And it's important to know how you can make sure that you're measuring up against other shippers in the volatile market. Traditionally, and I think it still holds today, a lot of supply chain professionals will use a fixed rate to benchmark their performance. For example, if I can hit 90% on-time performance, we're doing great. But, today we understand that success is a moving target, and that we have the tools to enable us to understand our position in reference to a changing market. So we should be doing that. So I think that market context is critical for interpreting performance. I like using this example. It's a little crude, but if I were to go to a mortgage lender today and ask for a loan for my house, and I received an APR of 8%, I'd laugh myself to another mortgage lender. But if it was 30 years ago and it was 1991, I'd be celebrating, because the average 30-year fixed rate was about 9.25%. So it's understanding that over time things change, and we need to be able to measure up against the market as the market's changing, and making sure that we are positioned positively against the market. And I think that a lot of that's done just by transparency and having the correct tools in your tool belt to be able to say, this is where we are today, and making sure that we're driving things that we need to drive. Thinking of another example, just from something more relevant, something more about the transportation industry, something that's changed over time just from the pandemic itself, thinking about spot market volume. Today, we're seeing spot market volumes just under 16% in comparison to total volume. Whereas at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw spot volumes just under 6%. So seeing a jump of about 10% in spot volume it's massive, and it's important to understand that context when you're planning your strategy for how to evade the spot market, because we've got rates of over 40% higher. Spot market rates are about 40% higher than our index rates. And so we need to work on a strategy for a lot of shippers. How do I get out of the spot market? And it's really important to understand that context to develop those strategies.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's been a topic that we've talked about here recently as well, because I think a lot of shippers are struggling with that because they recognize what's happening there. And then just talking about how things change. I mean, on-time delivery. Well, I think it was probably very difficult to hit 90% on-time delivery in Texas over the past couple of weeks, right? With the weather events there and everything else. So even at a very microcosm, lane by lane, basis, understanding the context and the different factors that could impact, things like on-time delivery, so maybe historically you've hit 90%, but maybe during that week period, if you were hitting 50%, you were great, particularly if your competitors were only doing 20%, right? So understanding, that I think is important. Tim, I'm going to shift gears now and talk over to you, and maybe building upon what Alan just said. We were talking about the spot market. I mean, how can companies use all this data that we've been talking about and collecting? How is that impacting, procurement strategy?
Yeah, I think, no, it's a good question. I think, one things we've seen is that, in the beginning of the pandemic, like any other change in the market, you start to see how from a procurement strategy, folks really, maybe hesitant to go to market because they're looking at it that, oh my God, the market's starting to change. If we go to market now, we're essentially going to be asking for a rate increase. But then, as Alan had mentioned about the spot market and how we saw that increase as much as we did, then it comes down to, well, maybe I'm better off to be moving my freight with updated rates versus going to the spot market. So, I think from a procurement standpoint, data has obviously always been important in the sense of going back, looking at history, looking at what lanes you've moved, making some assumptions based on what the volume is going to be the next year, and then just grabbing those lanes and putting them out to bid. I think one of the things that have changed over the past, few years and, continue to change is, that step, that takes place first before you go to market. So in determining that strategy, and it's also, do we need to go out to market with all of our bids? And some, without question, go to market every year. They put their whole network out there. But for others, we're starting to see that there's been a lot more work with really looking at the data, again, drilling into the data to understand the lanes. And, if you've got a lane that has, a high tender acceptance percentage where the carrier is competitive compared to a baseline or a benchmark, maybe you work with that carrier to just extend their rate or to extend the commitment. Is there really a reason to go out and bid it if the lane itself isn't broken? And as a result, I think a lot more shippers are really starting to, understand the importance. Everybody wants to talk partnership, but, they really are starting to understand the importance of, what it means for that carrier to completely tear up their network every single year, and it's not just your business, your lane, because there's backhauls and head hauls and, and deadhead mileage to live up to commitments and all this other stuff. So I think that, there's been more of a step that's taken place prior to going to market with really truly determining what lanes should I go to market with. And I think also too, in my example that I gave before about, do you want to penalize a carrier who committed to 500 loads a year when you've already tendered them 500 loads in the first 2 months? I think there's we're not necessarily there yet, but a lot more shippers are really starting to get to the point where they're looking at the data to say, what additional information can we give to our carriers so they really understand the lane that they're bidding on prior to bidding on it. So, we continue to look for ways to look at the data, to look at the opportunities, to really kind of show where those potential like peaks and valleys are throughout the year. Whereas in the early on, people would say, okay, all we're going to give you is our estimated annual volume number. Then we evolved and improved to get to the point where, okay, we're going to show you what the monthly breakout is, just to give you a little bit more information again around those peaks and valleys. But then more recently, I've seen with a few shippers, and some think it's overkill, some appreciate it, but I've seen where they've essentially just given them a supporting document that just shows a complete transactional history over the past year, where if a carrier chose to, they could really go into it and kind of understand which days of the week ship more than others, and really give them a lot of data to really understand again that the business that they're bidding on. So I think we're not necessarily there yet, but we continue to get better. As far as what data to provide to the carriers, even down to, before you'd say, okay, I need your rate from, Chicago, Illinois to Dallas, Texas. Well, maybe we should give you a little bit more information about who the customer actually is in Dallas, or what the average wait times are at the facilities, or, what are the average lead times. So, a carrier's not bidding thinking that they're going to get, load tenders, 48 hours in advance, but then all of a sudden they get awarded the freight and they start, trying to operate the freight, and it's all these same day load tenders that they're seeing. So I think if anything, it's really trying to arm the carriers with more information ahead of time, knowing that from a procurement process, the end result will probably be better. And even if, let's say, that end result means that the savings is a little bit less than it could be if you didn't provide a lot of data, the risks are limited, as far as then all of a sudden a carrier coming in after the fact and saying, I need more money, or this lane doesn't work for me because now I know XYZ 1, 2, 3. So I think there is just a lot more things that folks are looking at when it relates to data, as far as how what it is exactly that they should be presenting to their carriers or providing to their carriers.
You bring up a good point. I mean, I think that, and this is probably a topic for, another, episode, but I think that, certainly over the years, as shippers have become, even though there's still shippers out there, they're still managing their transportation with spreadsheets and so forth, a lot more are embracing, transportation management systems, and are leveraging, the technologies and the BI and the analytics and so forth, to run their operations smarter. Well, I think we've seen the same thing on the carrier side as well. I mean, I think, historically, a lot of carriers, particularly the smaller ones, have been behind the curve, if you will, with technology adoption. But because of same thing that's been happening on the shipper side, because of software as a service, because of, the cloud deployments, so on and so forth, they have now access to tools that perhaps were out of reach, 10, 15 years ago. So they're in a better position today to take that data, that information, those insights that shippers provide to them, to do that analysis on that end, so that they can provide more meaningful feedback and a more realistic response back to, the RFPs or the discussion. So I've seen kind of this, the carrier side of the equation becoming much more sophisticated as well, in terms of, being able to leverage that, that information. So Tim, before we kind of wrap up and get to our last question, just another question here. So you've done the procurement cycle. I mean, what should shippers do next to keep making smarter operational decisions?
No, and real quick before I answer that question, just kind of what you just said about the carriers being much more sophisticated. I think back to, I mentioned about, starting maybe the importance of letting carriers know who the customer is, on the receiving end. Even if a shipper doesn't, the carrier already knows. And if anything, they're just going to assume it's the worst, customer that they have to deliver into, and I think you're 100% right where, at times, I've worked with folks before where, they almost think that they're, pulling a fast one over on their partners, when in reality, the carrier knows more about their network than anyone within their organization, just because, they see it from a completely different lens. So, I mean, I think you're spot on with that. As far as, once the procurement cycle is, completed, and, what should folks be doing from an operational standpoint, for one, I'd make the argument that the procurement cycle is never completed. It's never done, so it's like, because when I look at it and say, you can run the greatest procurement event, you could run the best RFP in the world, but if you don't have, the ability to really manage it after the fact, you might have some slippage, or you might have some folks start failing, and if you don't have the visibility, then you can't fix it. And then you run into the situation that you talked about at the beginning of the call, where the one thing that none of us want is we don't want the CFO to all of a sudden be surprised and come knocking on your desk, or you're knocking on your door and saying, hey, what's going on here? Why are we seeing such a drastic increase with our costs? So I think when it comes to the procurement process, being done with the procurement process, and what should folks do next, really, I can't stress the importance of this conversation, and really having the proper operational metrics, along with having the ability to benchmark yourself against the market, so you can react quicker. You can start to understand when things start to fall apart, and try to put a solution in place before it becomes a huge financial impact. And when looking at the data, really understand why you're starting to see some of that slippage, or why you're starting to see some things fall apart. Does it go back to my initial example? Has there been a change within the network, or on a specific lane, where there's just a lot more freight than there used to be? And then what can you do with it, from there? Can you work with your carriers to see if they can commit to more? If they can't, does it make sense to go to market with maybe a mini bid? I had a conversation recently with a customer, and they were asking me about mini bids, and they want to go out to market every quarter with a mini bid, and their concern was, we're concerned that if we include a lane where carriers are hauling it today, that they're not going to like it. And I said, well, absolutely not, they're not going to like it. You don't want to all of a sudden develop the reputation that you're out there fishing for rates, or you're expecting everyone else to be living up to their commitments, but you're not going to do the same thing. So I think from an important standpoint is, you need to understand what's going on after you've awarded the freight. I think you can award your freight with confidence, but then also still monitor what's actually happening, and depending on what you're finding, allow that to drive what comes next. So whether it's, again, doing a mini bid, having calls with carriers, working internally with your customer service group, your forecasting group, your facilities, if that's the issue that's causing another issue to occur downstream. So it's once that procurement cycle is quote unquote complete, that just starts a whole new, even more important process. And that's really managing it to ensure that all commitments are being lived up to, including your own. And, and also then just making sure that you have a process in place. So when you do start to see something fall apart, that you already have a process as far as how you're going to address to that issue, so you can quickly correct that issue. So then all of a sudden, again, someone's not knocking on your door saying, hey, what's going on with this? And you're just looking at them with a kind of a blank stare, on your face. So, it's data it's been out there. We've seen it get better over the last couple decades, but it's now, I think the people are really starting to understand how powerful data actually is and what to do with it. And, and that's ultimately what makes that procurement cycle a success.
Yeah, a lot of great words of advice and insights there. So Alan, back to you, and as a way to wrap up, maybe even building upon what Tim just said. I mean, what ultimately is going to separate the leaders from the laggards when it comes to leveraging data to drive smarter decisions?
Yeah. Well, I think that leaders are going to understand where they position against the market. And I think that that market context is so critical to interpreting your own performance, because it enables shippers to be able to balance costs between service and really key in on what levers should I pull up and down to make sure that I'm making the correct decisions and creating the correct strategy in not just procurement, but other operational decisions to make sure that I have an effective strategy moving forward. And the freight market's always changing, and you want to make sure that you're keeping up with that. And so I think that leaders will key into that to ensure that they're making smart decisions moving forward. How about you, Tim? What do you think that leaders do to separate themselves from the laggards?
Yeah, no, I think it's that. I think it's, just being able to evolve, being able to look at something and realize that change is okay. And, if you sit back and think there's got to be a better way, chances are that there is. I think if anything, and, when I think from an operations standpoint or from a procurement standpoint, what isn't a strategy is that you implement, whether it's a procurement event or it's some other solution that you implement. What isn't a strategy is then after the fact that you just hope and pray that everything's going to work as you expected. Hoping and praying isn't an effective strategy. So it's really understanding that you have the tools and you have the process in place after the fact to really measure it and understand it. But then also, I think, Alan, to your point, why benchmarking is so important is, from a context standpoint, it's always important to really understand, how you're doing compared to others like you. So, again, we start talking about this procurement, and we start talking, I'm sorry, not procurement, but the pandemic, and we speak to, how the market's changed, how the spot market usage has increased. So, if everyone's just looking at it from a paper standpoint and they're saying, we were at 6%, 6% of our freight was going to the spot market, now 12% of our freight's going to the spot market. But data tells us industry, from an industry standpoint, 16, 18, 20% is going to the spot market. Is there room for improvement? Sure. But, when you're using that data to then educate the folks internally, you can really speak to the fact that, hey, yeah, things aren't good. Things have changed, but at the same time, we're still performing at a rate that's better than the market. And I think from a story standpoint, that really starts to tell a different story than if someone were just to say, hey, you were at 6%. Now you're at 12%. What the heck happened? Or, from a sky is falling standpoint, sometimes a little bit of context and education really kind of helps to put it into perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Well, both of you provided some great, insights and advice during this conversation. A lot to a lot to digest here, and I'm sure that we can probably go on talking for another hour about everything that's happening in the transportation market, because it is such a dynamic industry, and a lot of great things happening, a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities as well. But Alan, Tim, thank you both for making the time to be with us today.
Adrian, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, Adrian, I always look forward to our sessions. So thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Alan or Tim, you can post it there, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.